This works better for me. Because usually the way that, basically what you're getting now is basically the same thing we've been doing throughout several meetings through the spring and as we go into the summer, as I talked about last meeting. This is this outreach that we're doing to floodplain property owners and capturing their input. And we're just going to kind of go through that same thing tonight and capture the CAG's input. So I'll just run through a couple of slides with you and then kind of get into a few interactive pieces with you where you'll have to leave your seats for a few minutes. Just warning now. So for this part of the meeting, first what I wanted to start with is just give you an outline. We're just going to go over just have an overview of, just touch upon some of the things we talked about last meeting, just to give you a reminder and give you where we are at here. And then again, discuss the goals for what we're attempting to accomplish with these outreach meetings and capturing this input from folks. And I'll go over the format of how we do that as well. And then we'll get into talking about the cleanup options and trade-offs, and we'll do a couple interactive exercises, so that's where you get to get out from your seats there. And then the final discussion and wrap-up. And so what I'll do now is just go over the overview. So why are these, we talked about this last time, why are these meetings needed? And we talked about that before EPA started developing a plan for the Tittabawassee River floodplain, we wanted to meet with people who may be affected by our cleanup decisions and get an understanding of what's important to them and what they really care about before we select an option or a remedy. And who we invited to these meetings, we talked about this a little bit last meeting. I had talked to you about some of these tiered groups, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. But essentially who we're trying to reach out to is the Tittabawassee River floodplain property owners, in addition to community groups, organizations, and other community members that may be impacted or interested in EPA cleanup decisions. And when and where these are taking place, it's taking place now throughout the summer at various locations near the Tittabawassee River community. So that's where these are going on. And I showed this to you last time as well, the goals for these meetings. So what we're trying to accomplish, what we're trying to get from folks is to understand their values about the state of the floodplain and what we'd like to see, their desires for future conditions and uses. So that's one goal that we wanted to accomplish from these meetings. Another is to obtain feedback on the possible trade-offs that come with those cleanup options. So really get their feedback on those options that we're looking at for the floodplain. And then identify what other information may be needed by the community as we go forward. So we want to capture that as well. And the way that we formatted these meetings, is we've structured it basically into 3 sections. The first section is a discussion of current environmental and land use conditions in the Tittabawassee River floodplain. If you recall that pie chart I showed you last time, we're gonna spend some time with that again. And that kind of talks about that. And then after we look at that, we're going to do an interactive exercise and ask you to share your opinions on how the floodplain might look in the future. The second portion, the second section of this portion of our meeting tonight is a discussion of potential floodplain soil cleanup options and the outcomes and trade-offs between those options. And this is really the broad overview of what those options would be. We don't have details tonight because we don't have a plan yet. So remember, this is collection of information before we have a plan. So really broad overview, broad introduction, similar to what was described in this floodplain fact sheet that we have available in the front here, and you should have seen from last time. So just go over that quickly, and you guys have a lot of background on that already. So usually these meetings have been taking place about an hour and a half, and because we've kind of gone over some things before, I don't anticipate us spending all that time here. Then we have the third section of the discussion where we have this wrap-up portion. So hopefully we can hold your questions till that third part of this section, this discussion here. So with that, I wanted to get into current environmental conditions and current land use conditions. And you've seen this before. I'm just going to talk about it a little bit. I introduced this last meeting. Essentially, this map here is outlining the 8-year floodplain. This is kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about the floodplain as we go forward. We're really concentrating on the 8-year floodplain. And it starts where we're looking at is just south of the Dow plant and extends down to where the Tittabawassee meets with the Shiawassee River right before it comes into the Saginaw. Now, when we look at that 8-year floodplain within that area, we're looking at about 4,500 acres. So I mentioned this to you last time. So this is where we're concentrating, focusing where our cleanup would go, that 4,500 acres, that frequently flooded area, because what we're finding, and we've talked about this before as well, that frequently flooded area is, in general, where we're going to be finding the dioxin and furan contamination that would need to be addressed. So that's why those areas are being concentrated on. And this pie chart again, so if we think about that 4,500 acres, this is basically what you're going to have shape out. And these are, estimated land use, don't take these numbers and, bet the farm on them. But in general, this is what you're going to find. This is what you're going to find. And so you have over half you're going to find as undeveloped, low-use natural areas within that 4,500 acres, so about over half of that. And then another 15% is going to be with the Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge. That has about 15% of that 4,500 acres. And then you have 5% where it's residential, and these are maintained areas. So these are residential areas that are mowed and maintained within that 8-year floodplain area. Then you'll see 18 or so % of active agriculture, these actively farmed crop fields. And then 5% commercial, and then the 3% remaining of public parks such as Freeland Festival Park, West Michigan Park, Immerman Park, areas such as that. So what I wanted to, just before we talk about what we kind of want to see for the future for this 4,500 acres, what I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about is kind of the service that this natural area does. So if you combine this 50 or so % with this 15% of Shiawassee, plus you add in anything that you might have that's a natural area in those remaining areas, it's pretty easy to see how you could get to over 75% of this 4,500 acres is natural. Now, these natural areas do serve some purpose, and I just want to talk about some of those purposes with you now. One being, and I'm going to go back to my map here. So, one service that this floodplain area can serve is it really helps connect areas, natural areas of habitat, and helps increase their biodiversity. So I'm going to talk about that for a second. So if you have a natural area here and a natural habitat here, wildlife, they can connect and have access to those resources in those areas, thereby increasing their habitat resource, and then thereby increasing their biodiversity. Connections that rivers, not just the Tittabawassee rivers, but other rivers around the nation, this green corridor or a green zone can serve to help increase that biodiversity. So in connecting these areas that otherwise would have been isolated. So it serves that purpose. Another purpose that it serves is to help to absorb impacts from flooding. So areas that could have been maybe devastated further downstream, while you have these natural areas that could absorb those flooding impacts and help reduce that damage elsewhere. It also can help regulate river temperature, so it can serve that purpose, as well as, of course, recreational, cultural services as well. place for folks to go to enjoy nature, fish, as well as historically significant tribal lands, for example, is one example. So these natural areas just don't hang out and do nothing. They do serve some purposes that I just wanted to highlight for you. So, knowing that, we now get into our first interactive exercise. So, what I'm going to be asking the CAG to do, and certainly I have some materials if you guys wanted to participate in the audience as well, if you wanted to provide your input. We certainly have a venue for that. But mainly what we're trying to get from the CAG is understand how you would like to see this pie chart, this 4,500 acres, change or not change in the future. And the way that we would like to capture that is, I'm going to pull this up for a second. In this chart here, basically these land uses that you see here, these are the 6 land uses that we saw on that pie chart. They're listed here. And what I'm asking members of the CAG, if they could, is we have a poster board that we'll have in the back here. Yeah, in there. Looks just like this. So what we'll ask members of the CAG to do is take a look at these 6 areas. We'll have some dots that we'll be giving you. And what we'd like you to do is indicate for each one of these areas whether you'd like to see that increase, decrease, stay the same, or have no opinion. So we have this poster here. We'd ask you to just kind of take a look at this here and then let us know by voting through use of these dots if you'd like to see these areas either increase, decrease, stay the same, or not have an opinion. You have a question?
I'm sorry, I do have a question. Who owns, for example, that undeveloped piece is quite large. Who owns that? What, I mean, I
Sure.
understand it's underdeveloped. What is it?
So let's talk about this 54% could be residential areas that just are not, you know, they've let them go and just let our natural areas.
Part of these residential.
Sure. Mostly that's what that would entail.
Does that include houses that might be on West Michigan Drive, West Michigan Road? In the front of the house, basically the road is maintained, but the back part towards the river is left wild?
Exactly. So this is the 4,500 acres of the 8-year floodplain. So a lot of folks have their property extends out of the 8-year floodplain. So we're not talking about anything outside of that 8-year floodplain that may exist in the highlands, for example. This is just that lower part, just that 8-year floodplain where, you know, some folks, residential, don't mow all the way down there, or they just leave it native and not unmaintained. So those are the areas that I'm talking about in respect to that. You know, city and state also can own these undeveloped areas as well, not just private parties, but that includes those areas. Yes, Ryan.
For the low, it says low use undeveloped. Can that be, I mean, you can use it, but it's not restricted. I mean, I'd like to see wild areas, but I'd like to see people be able to use it and hike and bike and fish. So, I don't know, I mean, if I want to vote for low use undeveloped, am I voting for you can only use a piece of that? Or?
Well, there's already some restrictions that, so this is the floodplain area. And there are already restrictions that exist in those areas, such as, you know, building, and you know, there's state and local laws that prohibit some, limit some flexibility on those areas as it is. So, but outside of that, what you're thinking of, you know, unless there's already restrictions on that, then, yeah, think of it kind of just what you're.
It's kind of what I see like the Tittabawassee, you know, wildlife.
Yeah, so if you had
take that, I guess.
Diane, I wonder if you could help just kind of clarify the question you're really asking folks. So, how do you want to see areas restored that are being cleaned up on the floodplain in terms of what they look like after restoration? Or are you talking about actual land use changes and rezoning? And I mean, I think there's a number of things that might be a little confusing.
So, if we're just talking about, this is how it exists today. This is how that 4,500 acres exists
What's
today.
the mechanism by which changes would take place?
So I guess what we're trying to capture is, if knowing this, knowing how it is now, how would you like to see that change or not change?
But I guess, to follow up on Doug's, how would it change? I mean, I don't know if I can say any better, Doug, what's the mechanism that somebody would speculate to say, if I wanted to see more property inside Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge, how would that happen? Or I want to see more agriculture. I mean, what's the mechanism by which?
So, I mean, it sounds like you just want to know, well, okay, if we did increase that, how would that be done? Well, I don't know. This is kind of, the 3,000-foot level of how we would accomplish this. So, I don't have an exact path, if you're interested in increasing the area of Shiawassee, how that exactly would
Is that a
happen.
question you're trying to get at, though, kind of envisioning? Like, if you can start from scratch, what would you want the river to look like? Is
Yes,
that
because
kind of what you're asking?
this really helps us understand, if we go to implement a cleanup, and is the property use that we're looking at, and we'll get into this when we talk about options, is that in line with what folks wanted to see for the future of that floodplain area? If you had a choice in deciding how this floodplain would change or not change as far as use goes, what would that look like?
And along these same lines, is there also zoning? Can you show us what the zoning already looks like there? I mean, there's already.
In other words, let me just do a what if, okay?
Yeah.
So people would say, I'm a ardent recreationalist. I'd love to just see nothing but natural space so I can fish in peace and quiet and walk along the banks. And I think farming's exactly the wrong thing, right, to put there. Well, I think the farmers who are farming there probably would have a different opinion. And so, I mean, people might be reluctant to say, well, I think people should lose their farms. I guess there's a struggle here.
I agree. I mean, I think it has to be a very carefully done exercise, because I'm thinking about, when we as a nonprofit did a multi-county greenway plan a few years ago, where we had a number of meetings like this and asked similar questions. It's probably one thing for a nonprofit bunch of do-gooders to do that type of thing. It's a different thing, at least from my perspective, and I would suspect, knowing some of the folks around this community, it's a totally different thing for the federal government to come in and say, what would you like to see as part of this, and attach this to this cleanup effort, I think. I mean, it strikes me that it could be, okay, the federal government is going to start doing some things to these properties, whether it's acquiring them or somebody's going to acquire them and change the use on them, and the community, then the feds could then say, well, this is what the community said they wanted to see. So, I mean...
Well, you guys are really in-depth on this one. No, I understand your concern, and it's certainly, the government asking, how you feel like the community should change, and then we're going to just come in with our government hands and do that very thing and implement what you want here. That's not what this is informing us and telling us about. It's capturing what folks' values are. It's not dictating what EPA will do. So we still have to develop a cleanup plan. We still don't have that in hand. But by getting a feeling for how folks want to see things change or not change for that floodplain area, it helps us figure out, okay, well, it'll help us determine what options would be appropriate. If I don't really have any examples off the top of my head, but if folks decided to make all this active agriculture, that changes how we might approach that.
But that isn't even, that's not even a rational thing to say. You're not going to suddenly say, well, I think it should all be active agriculture, so Shiawassee and residential people and commercial people, you're out of luck. I guess I'm not really sure what you're trying to get at here. I think, for instance, my view is that I think we should clean up the spots that need to be cleaned up. I'm not necessarily, maybe my opinion is that I have no opinion about changing the use. That's not really the concern that I would have about the floodplain. It's more about how those different areas are treated in the remediation.
Okay.
I guess that if my view was that I didn't care about the undeveloped part, and I'd be happy if it was all developed and residential and commercial, then you might be less concerned about preserving the woods.
So, that tells us something, right? So if a lot of people, as we go through this process, you're one, we'll look at what the CAG says, as a whole and kind of look at that. But we'll also, with these folks that we're outreaching to, we're looking at where they're kind of placing their values on these things. You know, do they want to see more or less of areas if they could? You know, if they had the decision to make, if they could change the floodplain from where it is now.
The problem, Diana, I think you're in the right place in terms of what you want to get from folks, but you're asking the question in a way, you're asking a values question that's tied to actually somebody's property and whether or not they should continue to operate their property that way. And that's what's causing a lot of the confusion here. Joel?
Well, I guess I'm trying to figure this out too. For instance, undeveloped natural ecosystem. Let's say I don't want that changed. I want that natural part to stay there. But I'd like it to be cleaned up. If it's contaminated, what do I answer?
That is not captured here. Okay, this is just your floodplain. This is how it is today and how it's used. If you could change it or would like to see things change, how would that be? Stepping away from because you guys know so much about this project. I think we're kind of getting into the details a little much with this. It's just, I don't know how other way to ask it other than if you could change it?
I don't know that it's so much if you want to change it or not. It's what of these things do you value? What do you value in that area? More so than don't think of you're trying to make a change, but what are the things that you value?
Rather than asking people to specifically weigh in on different land uses, which gets them to trip over, well, you know, personally, I'd like to see no agriculture, but I'm not going to tell farmers they can't farm there if they're, but you might want to frame the question more generically to say, you know, what's most important to you to preserve? What do you most value about the floodplain area now? What are some things you'd like to see more of on the floodplain, rather than tie it to very specific kind of things, because this is just too specific for folks to ask, make this go away, make more of this. Okay,
so I guess the goal of what we were trying to accomplish with this piece was to give you 6 dots and put here in each one of these land use categories as to whether you'd like to see those increase, decrease, stay the same, or have no opinion. So are we saying we're not going to be able to get there with this?
Just kind of reframe it a little bit.
What if the words, instead of increase, decrease, simply no opinion, were high value, low value, high value, low value, and no opinion? That might get you where you want to be, with this group at least. What is of high value, what is of less value, and what doesn't matter?
I think people can just divorce themselves a little bit of that. Make this go away. That would help. The high value, low value is good. Any other thoughts?
You've done this already with some groups.
Terry had a question.
Yes.
Terry?
I know you're trying to get at the value of this, but would it be correct to say that there are implications in terms of the cleanup? If, as Drummond suggested, there was a general consensus that this area is a prime area for development, that it could go commercial and residential, and that everybody is really concerned about seeing this development occur, it would have to be cleaned up at a much higher level than if everybody agreed that probably extending the wild or green area and spaces would be far preferable use of this area.
Well, it certainly would help inform us how we would apply the options as we get into this next piece of this discussion. It would help us, and I'll get there again too, because we're looking at these 3 different options, and what's likely to happen is we're going to do a combination of those options. And if there's an interest overall in the community as we're going out there and we're seeing a pattern come back, and there's a lot, folks are coming back and telling us that something, they would like to see something change or in these areas, that helps inform us as to, well, how do we apply these options and how that could look when we go to propose a plan. And again, that plan isn't proposed. We are still going to, this is a really informal piece here when it comes to informing that plan. And we are going to go through the normal EPA process of public comment, because in 2014, we're going to come forward with that plan for the floodplain. We're going to have public comment. We're going to be able to capture those formal things on that plan itself. So this isn't the last place for, you're not locking EPA into a decision here with what you're telling us about
So
this.
to help with this along and not kick this dead horse any further, are folks are comfortable with that kind of high value, low value use of the floodplain moving forward, and just using those as general descriptors for that?
I'd like just a little more information. Just say, for instance, the K came out, doesn't make any difference which category. Residentials are number one. Now, what are you going to do with that information? How's that going to impact your decisions?
Well, it's hard to say because we don't have a plan. I mean, this is just gonna, we'll be able to come away from the CAG saying, okay, this is how they laid out, but we also have all the other folks that we're getting information from to consider as well. And you guys are here as members representing specific groups of the community, and bringing that to the table here in a different format.
But my question is, I don't care how many groups you have. Something comes out high. How is that going to impact your decision making? What are you going to do with that information?
And we just aren't there yet because I don't know, I can't, there's several different ways to do this.
I'm not going to put my thoughts on
Wendy?
it.
I guess where I'm kind of struggling here is the idea that every piece of land as we go is in some sort of governmental entity, a township or a city or county, whatever, that has a land use plan. So theoretically, the community has spoken through those land use plans. How would we weigh that versus kind of our top of mind, I'm thinking nature today?
All right, let's go back to some of the groups that we're trying to target for outreach. Floodplain property owners also include public entities, townships, and the like, and we are meeting with them separately to understand what they would like to see in the development of within their properties within those 8-year floodplains. So we're getting that separately, and as well as from other stakeholders getting their input and just collecting. We're in collection mode right now. We're not really in a place where we're in analytics or understand kind of where we are with it. We need to collect the information. We need to collect the values, and and then we're also going to present that to everyone here, kind of what we're finding once all those meetings are finished. I don't have a snapshot of where we are with what the information that we've collected. We're just collecting. I mean, that's kind of where we are with this piece right now. So, I mean...
Are you okay proceeding with the high value?
I mean, if that's what you guys need to do, then yeah, of course, we can record that moving forward, that this is why you view this.
Is it true or not true that while we have some residences currently in the floodplain, do people now get building permits to build a building in a floodplain?
Well,
So to me, to say increased residential in a floodplain is counterintuitive if it's impossible, right?
right. I mean, you can't go and build a house in that area, but if you had.
So we can't increase residential.
But that residential is that maintained area, if you remember. So if you want to see more manicured lawns in those areas, for example.
I think you can build a floodplain, not the floodway.
There's certain
There's
conditions.
certain conditions, but you can build it.
It's permitted through the state, which is an authority that's getting from FEMA.
And there's restrictions, so, I mean,
But you're right, like every piece of property in Saginaw Township, has a zoning right now. You can tell you can look right at your map, you go down to the township office, and they'll show you what each piece is zoned for, potentially. And you have a future land use map that shows you what they intend in the future. I mean,
and if we're going to really get stuck on this piece, if we could agree, like you're talking about, to move on, if we say high value, low value, same opinion, is that kind of where we were at with this? If that's what most of you need to do to make a decision here, I mean, by all means. But this is really just part of the discussion. There's this other piece that's really kind of important when we talk about the options that we would apply to the floodplain and kind of capturing your values with that. So.
Let's move on to quick dots.
If we can move on to these dots piece, if you guys would feel comfortable with this portion, Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next piece.
I was just concerned about the low use aspect and the cleanup effort, because that is how we judge the cleanup practice use. Low use, high use, I mean, right? Because now they can move the DNAPL or the other sediment from the Midland homes to the lower use area. But I would like to see the low use areas cleaned up as well, so.
And that's not reflected here.
So that's the question,
Undeveloped.
question about the relationship between cleanup levels and land use, and would that also play out in these kind of criteria?
That's why I asked, I guess originally, because I like undeveloped natural ecosystem, but I didn't want to say I'll vote for low use because it wouldn't be cleaned up as much, right?
Diane, doesn't that come into play in the next sections we start talking about the trade-offs? So
Yeah, because no matter what EPA does, it's going to be protective. I don't want you to think that if whatever option we apply would end up would be protective. So, I mean, it just, it was meant to just capture kind of, if you could do anything with the floodplain, would you change it? And would you, or would you like to see other areas increase or decrease? So, I mean, if members of the CAG, you know, if you guys can't really, if we can't move on, then we'll just move on with it from this one. If we can't capture kind of, if you'd like to see this change or not, or absorb.
Let's move on.
Let's get to that. I think it's a pretty complex question. I don't feel comfortable.
Well, hold on.
I would feel, I'm not comfortable allowing a belief out there to think that we are undecided, because I think we have lots and lots of ideas. We just don't feel that we have the ability to place value judgments that might have some impact on a decision 2 years down the road and have it reflect the position that we're in today, right?
Diane, how have people reacted to that exercise? Have people raised any of these things, or is this?
I mean, this is definitely the most stuff I guess we've gotten. A lot of folks, you know, they have questions as far as, you know, what does that mean as far as, you know, in relation to the cleanup? Like, I want to see cleanup happen first, and that. So I asked them just to step away and just kind of look at it as if it was a non-issue and more of, you know, this is something that you could have an effect in versus the way that it's used now. Would you change it? Would you change that pie chart? Would you, you know, and I understand there's other complexities that you guys are bringing forth here, especially given the sensitivities of the CAG. I mean, I recognize that. So, you know, I certainly don't want to put you guys in a bad position in offering anything. And if the CAG itself, you know, if you guys don't feel comfortable about this, then we don't have to record what your opinion is on it.
I think one of the concerns I have, I mean, maybe it's a broader concern from a CAG member, not speaking for the CAG, but our relationship perhaps to activities such as this, where the EPA is going out and talking to the public, and part of me thinks that maybe this discussion needs to take place before this stuff goes out to the public, so that we can kind of have this roundtable discussion about, you know, are the questions correct? You know, I don't want to. I assume nobody from the CAG goes with you to any of these meetings. I don't think we've been asked. I mean, I would be glad to had I known about them, but you know, I want to make sure that folks know that this group here that is supposedly representing the public, you know, can kind of provide some input to this before they see it, I guess. You know, so I'm kind of concerned about, you know, what our role is perhaps relative to what the EPA is doing out in the public. Does that make any sense to you? I mean, I'm just trying to figure out, you know, should we be seeing this before the public sees it? Or is that not relevant?
Because you guys were part of our outreach focus. You guys were, if you remember, your CAG was a part of the Tier 2 group. We wanted to capture values and get, you know, remember the goals. We're just trying to get an understanding of where people are at with things. And the CAG was a part of that.
I think Michael's point though is that if you had brought this exercise to the CAG and said, this is what we're thinking of doing, they would have dissuaded you from asking the question that way. Because it really does bring up some things that I think are at best confusing, at worst perhaps troubling.
And we certainly can have that, when we summarize this information, and we're certainly going to be transparent in telling you, this is what we put out there, this is what we found, and, these concerns that you guys bring forth are, those are notes to be made on this information that we have, okay? So, we could spend a year designing a good study for this outreach, but just kind of the main goals of what we're trying to do.
There are some simple sort of antenna that go up the way you frame this. That by checking in with a group like this, with an early warning, they would have said, we understand what you're trying to get at, but there might have been a better way to frame this to get you.
Yeah, I don't think we would have dissuaded her. I mean, that perhaps we would have thought of, here's maybe a better way to ask the question. I mean, as a group that represents the public, I mean, here are some of the issues that you might run into when you ask these questions. Or, perhaps, the worst thing I can think would happen was that, the EPA folks go out and ask this, and there's some assumption made out there by people that know that there is a CAG that, maybe this has been endorsed by the CAG, which, clearly, based on this discussion, I don't think we're there yet.
I went to one.
You did, okay.
I would probably say, I don't know how many people were there.
That was one of our bigger meetings, at 20, maybe.
There was 20. Maybe 2 people there knew that CAG even existed.
There you go.
We went around and I told people that I sat on the CAG and that, we have the community interest at heart and we're keeping abreast of what, what's going on, trying to hasten and make good decisions as far as cleanup. What we're doing here is reading way, way, way more into this than the general public sees. They just looked at this as a straightforward question, what would you like to see later on? And they want to put their little dots on the board.
But I think, Len, that's why we're here.
I understand.
Right, I agree with you. I think that's a good point.
And
Let's move on.
concerns noted. Next piece. Let's talk about the floodplain option, shall we?
We don't like this either.
Oh, yeah. First piece, yeah.
What do you mean by floodplain?
You brave torrential rainstorms for this?
Mary knew this was going to happen, that's why she left. Or she wasn't. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Okay, so cleanup options that we would be looking at, and this is also expressed in this fact sheet as well. So what we're going to be looking at in this situation, for the contamination we have and the location we have it, the floodplain, we have about 3 different cleanup options that we can consider. One of those is soil removal. Now, I'm just going to get into the broad overview of what that entails, and I know that you guys know very well through just the experiences that you've had with these meetings what this means. So basically, I'll just reiterate that again. Soil removal is digging up the contaminated soil and replacing it with clean soil, and that area would then, could be regraded or new soil brought in to replace what was taken out. The contaminated soil would be transported off-site for disposal to landfill, and of course this would have an impact to the current ecosystem. So that's, in a nutshell, what soil removal is. Now, the soil cover really just involves placing cover over or clean material over the contaminated soil, and it keeps people and animals away from that and from coming into contact with contamination. And it would be designed in a way to stop rainwater and wind from washing or blowing away the contaminated soil, and also monitoring, we take a look at how that is, if there needs to be repairs or anything done on that. So it would be designed to really keep people and animals away from the contamination. And again, the current ecosystem would be affected by implementing that option. The final one is land use management, and this is a tool. Again, we talked about how there already exists restrictions and rules on the floodplain and what you can do in that area. But this would be something, addition to that, it puts legal limits on the use of property. and it would keep areas in the natural condition. It doesn't keep wildlife away from the contamination. And as I said, Michigan and the federal already have restrictions on what you can do in those areas anyway. But it would really serve to protect folks from coming in contact with that contamination through those land use tools, those land use management tools. Things to keep in mind when you think about the three of these is that EPA is going, no matter what it does, it's going to pick something that's protective. So each option will protect the people and the environment under the right conditions. And all of these have impacts or trade-offs that you need to consider. So nothing's 100%. You know, you have to weigh the things that come with each one, implementing each one of those options. And likely, as I mentioned before, what's going to happen is a mixed approach combining the options, providing the best balance among the trade-offs in floodplain cleanup. So knowing that is important, because we're probably going to do a combination of these. How that combination lays out really will help be informed by the feedback that we get from yourselves and also the people we interact with in the public for floodplain property owners. So with that, I wanted to talk about some of the trade-offs that are associated with each one of these options. This is a table that's also in your fact sheet there. And let's go over this real quickly, the impacts that we would find. So the first one we talk about is flexibility for future land use. And this is the range of land uses that can be applied in the future. And land use management provides the least, let's see, pointer out here. Land use management provides the least flexible. You have restrictions you got to follow on those. The soil cover is somewhat flexible. You have some things you could do outside of that with that soil cover in place. But the soil removal and disposal really gives you the most flexibility because you're taking that contamination out. So that's kind of how that lays out. And again, remember that you don't have unlimited flexibility in those areas, but when implementing these different options, this is what we're talking about here for flexibility. The next piece is impacts to the ecosystem, and that refers to the effects that the option has on the existing floodplain habitat. And land use management has the least impact because you're really just leaving things as they are now. The soil cover has a little more impact. You are having to come in there with equipment and implement some of the soil cover options. And then the most impact you would have with soil removal and disposal to the ecosystem as it exists now, because you are going to be changing that through removing that soil and bringing in that traffic to haul that soil out and bring in the new soil. The next trade-off I would like you to think about is the time to implement and achieve protection. So how long would this take to put in? How long would these options take to put in? And with land use management, it's going to take the least amount of time as compared to the rest of these. So you can implement that. And then a little bit more time to implement the soil cover option. Again, you're mobilizing equipment, you're bringing in things, so that's going to take more time. And then the most time to implement that, the soil removal and disposal, because you have a lot of equipment that you're having to pull in and soil disposal issues and transporting that off-site. So that's where you're looking at there. For the next trade-off to think about, reliance on monitoring and maintenance. So to implement the land use management option, you really need to use monitoring to make sure that that land use option is being used as per the agreement. So you have to monitor that and make sure that those are being followed. Soil cover option, it really relies on both monitoring and maintenance. You got to make sure that that cap is still performing as per design. And you need to monitor that, make sure that it's good, and then if you need to perform any maintenance that may be required to make sure that that's at optimal performance. And then finally, for soil removal and disposal, least to no reliance on monitoring because you've really removed what you'd be watching for people to come in contact with. So that's something to consider with those three options. The next trade-off to think about are the short-term worker and community impact. And this focuses on the physical potential physical and safety impacts to coworkers and the community, and then social impacts as well. You know, you're going to have to be dealing with things like truck traffic and those kinds of issues. So short-term worker impacts, the least short-term impacts you have with land use management options. So because you're not, mobilizing equipment that could pose a safety risk. And then more short-term impacts you'll find with the soil cover option. And then the most short-term impacts, of course, with implementing that soil removal and disposal. Again, you have, increased traffic, increased fuel usage, those types of things. Now, you can certainly minimize safety issues by having proper plans, so we could, of course, that would be followed. You would do the utmost, take the utmost care in making sure that safety is number one there. But nonetheless, those do exist, just so you have your eyes wide open on that. Finally, the next trade-off to consider is cost. And I emphasize here and also in the public meetings that, or the community meetings, that this is not a cost that is carried by the landowner. So keeping that in mind, the least amount of cost would be from implementing the cleanup option for land use management. More cost, all that equipment that you're putting into place here, the soil cover option. And again, the most cost you would find with soil removal and disposal, you got to consider you're taking that soil to a landfill. So there's disposal costs that are associated with that one, which really ups the price of that. So, as well as for both of these, you have to mobilize that equipment and folks to get that implemented. So, those are the trade-offs to consider when looking at these three options. Let's see. So what I have next, another interactive exercise. Woo! Are those over here, Mary? Yes. Okay. So essentially what we have here, and if you could go ahead and... You want to go ahead? Go ahead. I want to give them the full experience. What I'm going to be handing out to you is, essentially it's a worksheet. And what it has, we had 6 before, now we have 30. And these are 30 statements that are associated with, and some of these statements are associated with each one of these trade-offs that we talked about. And there's a series of statements listed here. And what I hope to ask the CAG is to take a look at those 30 statements. And you have 10 votes, basically, to decide out of those 30 which ones you most agree with. And then what you would do, you can place your marks on this worksheet here, and then we have posters that you could then use dots and place your votes that you had on the worksheet and go ahead and place them around on the boards there. And we also have, if you find out of these 30 that there's something missing, we do have some space at the back that you could add, and we also have a board that says other, make up your own type statements, and you could add that there and then vote on that as well. And you have, again, you have 10 votes out of these 30 statements to place, but if you feel really strongly about a statement, you can actually place one of your votes, you could place it up to actually, one of the 10, you could place it up to 3 times. So if you find a statement that you feel strongly about, you can vote once, you can even vote twice, and up to 3 times. But that does count against your total of 10, so you then have 7 then to work with. I did want to draw your attention to number 3. However, I just want to talk about this for a second. So 3 and several other questions on here have this statement where it says, it has this parentheses that describes in below, and I want to talk about that. Number 3, there are specific areas within the floodplain where flexibility in land use should be maintained. And then we ask if you could write down those specific areas or criteria that would make an area qualify, and then post it next to this statement. So if you want to vote for that one and you have a specific one that you're talking about, could you write that down for us? And we have Post-it notes that you could post that on and place it next to the question on the board. And then that will tell us what specific criteria you were thinking of. So with that, I will let you read the 30 questions.
They just kind of swarm around. I think worksheets?
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and those who are finished with their worksheet, I'll go ahead and just come around and get those that you have. So where do you go? Yeah. On that part.
Yeah, it looks like spring next.
I know. Okay, so I just wanted to, before we kind of came to this questions portion, wrap up here, point out a couple things for you. Again, we are expecting this proposal in 2014. So we're gathering this input through the summer from folks. Again, emphasize we're attempting to outreach to 600 to 700 or so folks who live along that the river that have own parts of that 4,500 acres. So quite an effort that we've been trying to undertake here and gathering people at these meetings. But the results from those meetings, we plan to summarize in our fall newsletter. Again, I want to remind you, we are having our spring newsletter in a couple weeks, so look for that. But the fall newsletter, we anticipate having some kind of summary as to, these meetings and some of our findings in that. We also, of course, wanted to provide a summary for the CAG at one of the fall CAG meetings, if there's time in the agenda to do so. But we wanted to do that for sure. So that's kind of where we are with this, and then I have this last portion with questions here that we can go back to the CAG here.
So you're going to present the summary of the public community meetings after you want the CAG's input on the options?
A different set of options.
No, that's segment 2. Are you thinking segment 2? Segment 2. This is for the floodplain. And that's for 2014, that proposal, that proposed plan. So, anything else about, and yeah, we wanted to summarize kind of our findings. We're collecting information like this. We're collecting information from the land use that you guys looked at before, and just having meetings to collect that and hopefully have some summary for you in the fall. Are there any other questions about? You guys are a good group.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you.
Remember, so Ryan, Len, Maura, and David are the membership committee. They're going to be working hard over the next few months to kind of beat the bushes. If you know of anyone or have any ideas, either please forward them to the committee or distribute application forms yourself. But we really do want to try to get a good crowd in here to get possible new members in July. And also remember the opening for the leadership team. Get any nominations or self-nominations to the leadership team before the next meeting.
And if Len nominates anyone, I'll run it by that person.
You'll do it great.
Yeah, you can find the application too for the membership on our website or our Facebook page. They're not on there now, but we'll get them on there in the next few days.
All right.
I'll get them.
back to you, leadership, anything?
No, I don't think so.
All right, thanks, everybody, have a great night. July 15th, next meeting.